If you clicked on this video, you probably know the Scott Pilgrim animated series, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, came out a few months ago. The Netflix original series was marketed as an animated retelling of the Scott Pilgrim graphic novels, which would use the cast of the movie to tell the story more accurately this time. You see, despite the cult popularity of the movie, it isn't fully accurate to the graphic novels. The show is going to change that. The idea isn't necessarily all that shocking nowadays. A lot of books are being turned into shows instead of movies because the longer seasons allow for more accuracy than a 2-hour movie. So, if you're going to do 5 books, why not do 5 seasons instead of 5 movies? With Scott Pilgrim, you're looking at graphic novels, so it is different. It should be shorter, and you may not need to do 1 season per novel. A 2-hour movie might be too short, but 8 half-an-hour episodes might be perfect. So, Scott Pilgrim was set to face the world in a comic-accurate adaptation, and maybe you were set to subscribe to my channel? Maybe it would be appreciated? By the way, I know there are also video games that adapt the story, but I'm in finals as I write this, so I'm not going to go out of my way to talk about that. Spoilers. The thing is, the show is not that. It was, for most of one episode, but then they did something unexpected. They killed off the worst character. They killed off the main character. Scott dies. Matthew Patel, the first evil ex-boyfriend, rocked his shit, and everyone who had watched him until that point sighed in relief because this guy's unbearable. Which, in many ways, made him more comic accurate, actually. Ramona becomes the new protagonist of the series. Unfortunately, we soon discover that Scott did not die. But he is missing. Ramona decides to face her evil exes to find which one of them did this. With the movie being closer to the source material, you don't need to read the comics to know that this isn't how the story normally goes. Normally, Scott fights them so that he could date her. And along the way, we learn more about the two characters, bringing them closer together or pulling them apart depending on what the challenge is. With no Scott to do the fighting, Ramona does it instead. She doesn't really fight most of them, actually. There are still fights in most episodes, but they no longer really center around defeating the ex-boyfriends. It becomes an opportunity for the exes and Ramona to find closure in their relationships and grow from them. Most of the exes aren't evil, they're just hurt. Come on, babe, I didn't mean to form a league of evil exes. I guess it's just that hurt people hurt people. Ha 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 ha. I'm sorry, I hate myself. Confronting their past and actually communicating why things happened the way they did allows the exes to become allies in Ramona's search for Scott, and allows Ramona to grow, becoming better fit for whichever relationships she will have in the future. This also allows for new scenarios and character dynamics that end up being really engaging. The thread connecting all these characters previously was Scott. In a piece of media without Scott, what happens? Knives becomes the new bass player for Sex Bombs. Todd, played by the second best Superman actor to date after Christopher Reeves, gets in a situationship with Wallace. We see a really wholesome friendship form between Lucas Lee and Gideon. Man, we even learn that the twins and Scott eventually become really close friends. Overall, removing Scott from the equation allows for a lot more ways to develop and explore these characters. This adds a lot because in most Scott Pilgrim media, these characters almost feel two-dimensional, as we're supposed to understand that to Scott they essentially are. Most of these characters feel like the same versions of themselves we know from before, just with new experiences here and there. So it's very rewarding to watch for viewers who are familiar with the movie or graphic novels, as you get to essentially see a what-if scenario. I do think the story here is still good enough to hold its own as its own piece of Scott Pilgrim media. It's a genuinely very good story about how relationships come to a close and how this is often very messy and harmful for those involved. It's about recognizing your role in that and how to properly heal from there. It was quite nice to get a new Scott Pilgrim story while keeping the themes and characters the series is known for. especially since we already have an adaptation that feels like an abbreviated version of the novels with the movie. Well, except the movie isn't really that either. Are you noticing a trend here?
Password.
Whatever.
Cool. Second password. Cool.
I don't know, man. The first album is much better than the first album.
Scott!
Let it go. Don't give him the satisfaction.
What if I want the satisfaction?
When discussing the Scott Pilgrim movie, we need to keep in mind the behind-the-scenes situation that took place during its production. The movie was in the works since the first graphic novel came out, with director Edgar Wright being involved very early on. The movie itself was being written in collaboration with creator Brian Lee O'Malley, which resulted in the movie having influence over the upcoming volumes, while the movie itself stayed loyal to the graphic novels, for the most part. This starts to deviate with the final two novels, as they were yet to be published by the time the script had to be finished. The fifth volume was likely completed, or near completed, behind the scenes, but the producers only had access to O'Malley's notes for the final, and the writer's strike was about to begin. The ending of the movie is decidedly different from the books, and a few changes are made here and there as well. Things that don't necessarily lead to much more in the movie are cut out, whereas they were integral to the book. Basically, they did what Game of Thrones Season 8 couldn't do, and finished without the book but still made it good. I don't think this makes one version worse than the other. I think this just makes them two different tellings of the same story. There are things that were cut that I do think really do benefit the overall themes of the series. To me, Scott's confrontation with... I'm not gonna say that. Scott's confrontation with evil Scott is probably the climax of the books, in my opinion, as it finally forces Scott to face how shitty he is, though still nothing about how annoying he is. And the books make a lot more of a point in showing us that Scott is not all that great. We learn that the story he tells about how he saved Kim from a kidnapper is a false memory he fabricated. He beat up her nerdy boyfriend and taught himself to view it as a moment of heroism. The only way for Scott to beat this manifestation of all the bad things he's done is to recognize them as his own, to learn and grow from them. Instead, in the movie, he's pretty much just another Scott, and there doesn't need to be a fight between the two. They kinda just talk it out. It's a funny joke, and admittedly, the version of Scott in the movie isn't quite as shitty, so the fight would not have worked as well, nor would it really fit in with the pacing of the movie. Really, the pacing is a difference of its own. The movie is very fast-paced to fit everything it needs to fit in the short period of time it has, that also result in being set over a small period of time. The books, however, are set over more than a year. This allows for more to take place. Knives and Steven develop a close friendship. Steven discovers that he's homosexual. Knives also turns 18 while Scott and Ramona are broken up. And the second he learns of this, Scott offers to have casual sex with her. You really do be a Toronto mans. Knives turns him down though, as she's grown a lot since their relationship and isn't really looking to have a romantic partnership with him in any way. It's a really powerful moment of growth for the character. She kind of outgrew Scott. They do kiss, but both of them find it terrible, agreeing to never do it again. She even leaves the hellhole that's Toronto by the end of the series, heading to UBC or McGill for her undergrad. Also, Ramona didn't leave him for Gideon. She left him to try to move on. To leave all of this behind her. These were really interesting decisions that do benefit the story as far as I'm concerned, but I also see why they couldn't really fit that into the movie if they wanted it all to work out. On the flip side, I think the movie has a lot of fun and interesting contributions of its own. Like the fight with the stunt doubles, which was so nice that they did it twice. And I do recognize that the movie couldn't possibly fit everything together. I think the decision to center the movie around the Battle of the Bands does a lot to keep it together because it could have otherwise been so messy with how much they had to cut out. Also, I've read the books, and for the life of me, I still can't really tell you what the glow around Ramona's head was. So, the microchip was probably a pretty good idea. I think it really does show the type of possessive and creepy man a lot of women have to deal with, unfortunately. Adding to this, we do know that there were a lot of ideas that were originally developed during the pre-production of the movie that found their way into the books because the creator was working on both of them. So, there are likely more examples that I can't really think of that originate from the movie. Not to mention the absolutely fantastic cast. So, we see that even though the movie follows the premise of the books more closely, it isn't really an accurate retelling of the story. Because it couldn't be. It did not have the time to, nor did it have a complete story to base itself off of. But most of the fanbase doesn't mind. In fact, most of the fanbase loves the movie. Which is weird when you hear so many other fanbases consistently moan about accuracy. Especially when it comes to comics.
Oh no. Julie Bowers versus Lucas Lee and Gordon Goose. Fight!
Stop! This is stupid! Let's all be adults for once, okay? Julie, what are you doing?
I don't know. Guess I got caught up in the moment.
Lucas, you can't live here. That's ridiculous. Find your own place.
I'm flat broke. I can't even afford a first-class flight back to LA. And the only work I can get is voicing an animated series. Lucas Lee is live action or nothing.
You might need to open your mind to other opportunities. And you! Stop being a loser. And treat Julie better than you treated me.
What I take from this is that when it comes to adapting an existing piece of media, deviating from the source material is fine. In fact, I would prefer it. Having the same stories told time and time again, just in different formats, is way less interesting than having 3 different stories from a property you like or even love. Especially because often a story works best in the format it was originally told in, because it was made for that format. However, in a lot of corners of fandom, accuracy becomes the way to measure quality of a project. I've seen this a lot in comic book circles. When I was a teen who had grown up with comics, I believed this as well. I know people who still use this as the greatest measure of quality. Mind you, I wouldn't say the different versions of Scott Pilgrim are inherently inaccurate. As I mentioned before, there are repeated themes and ideas through all 3 versions of the story, and the characters are the same. We have lines and scenes that are identical in all 3. But the stories do end up being different. I think what the adaptations offer is the essence of Scott Pilgrim, for lack of a better word. They understand what makes Scott Pilgrim work and how that works, so they have more leeway to try new things, because the viewer will still view this as Scott Pilgrim at the end of the day. When looking at their stories, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World are not comic accurate, but in a lot of ways, they are. These are not the only adaptations to do this, and they aren't the first ones either. If we break it down, many adaptations function this way. Most comic book movies and shows don't follow their source material too closely, instead telling their own stories, which, I think, is the beauty of retelling these stories in different formats. The freedom it provides to make changes and make the story its own, instead of the same story in a different coat of paint. And yet, accuracy to the source material is still prominent in many fandom circles. So yeah, my take regarding this is, accuracy only really matters in essence. If the story told captures that, then I much prefer get a new story than see the same one told again. I think these discussions of accuracy need to die off for the most part. It doesn't mean anything about the quality, and projects that end up bad are not bad specifically because it didn't follow the source material. Sure, if the project is bad, it would probably be better if it followed the source material, but that's not the reason behind the poor quality. For fans of any version of Scott Pilgrim, the franchise, not the guy, I really recommend checking out the other 2. I think the 3 versions really complement each other, giving a more complete version of the franchise. Thank you for watching me ramble about how these shows and movies being different means that other people are wrong and I'm right? It's really appreciated. Please, let me know I'm even more right than I think, and consider subscribing or checking out my other videos. Recommend any show or movie you may enjoy. Who knows? I might make a video about it.